So thank you again. I'm really grateful that you have joined. I'm really excited to be presenting on this work. So I will jump right in, and I'm going to start with two claims that I will then attempt to back up. Okay. The first one is that Southeast Asia is the most important region in the world for implementing land use sector climate solutions. The second claim is that we can use science to target and prioritize interventions. Okay, so let me start with that first claim. Southeast Asia is the most important region in the world for climate actions on land. And so I want to start to address that. And first, real quick, for the North American audience, these are the 11 countries that comprise Southeast Asia. So, okay, so why Southeast Asia? Okay, and I'm going to highlight three reasons for this. One is that there are disproportionate greenhouse gas emissions from the land use sector. One is that there are trends in consumption patterns that will put pressure on that to increase. And third is that adaptation due to climate change will force intervention anyway. So let me back up those claims with some numbers. So disproportionate emissions. So first, let's take a look at climate emissions around the globe. 22% of all greenhouse gas emissions are from the land use sector. Okay, about half of that is what happens on the farm, and half is associated with land clearing for agriculture. Okay, so 22%, that's around a fifth to a quarter. That seems pretty large. And it is when you think of all the other sectors, transportation, industry, mining, everything. But in Southeast Asia, it's not 22%, it's 54%. Over half of all the emissions are from land use. Okay, and to repeat, everything else, industry, transportation, electricity, mining is less than half. Okay, so really important to focus on land use there. So for consumption trends, okay, what drives land use? Usually agriculture. Okay, and calories per person per day has increased by over 10% in less than a decade, and that could increase. And I want to be very clear on something. Caloric inputs increasing in Southeast Asia is actually a good thing, right? There's a substantially large population in Southeast Asia that's food insecure. So there being more food available is good. However, I do note the trend, and right here I'm showing, in red Southeast Asia, and the blue line is the European Union, just for a point of comparison, right? That there eventually, hopefully, Southeast Asia will catch up. Okay, consumption of animal products is increasing. Again, it's admirably low for now, and again, that increase is not a bad thing if it means there's more food security for vulnerable people in Southeast Asia. But again, the trend is such that this could in the future create pressure on natural ecosystems. One bit of good news is that beef consumption remains low, and beef really stands out because the climate emissions associated with beef are so very high, and I will be talking about that a little bit more. Okay, and the third point I want to make to buttress my first claim that climate action is so important in Southeast Asia in the land sector is that there's vulnerability to climate change. Okay, the ADB, the Asia Development Bank, reports that Southeast Asia is particularly vulnerable to climate change. Okay, and adaptation will force changes in the ag sector. So that represents an opportunity to make these changes in a way that leaves farmers better off, and not just like poorly thought out adapting to changes in heat waves or something. So here are two of the adaptation issues. There's a lot that are out there. Here are two that I find interesting, and we'll circle back to solutions I'll be talking about soon. One is that shorter seasons will stress crop rotations. Okay, and the seasons will be constrained by farmers need to have plants, crops growing in a way that avoids certain patterns of rainfall or heat. And so right now, there's some pressure on farmers to plant the crops at the right times so they can multi-crop. Their freedom to operate will be limited. Another thing that is predicted to happen more and more under climate change is heavier reliance on groundwater irrigation, okay, as patterns of rainfall change. Okay, and so those will require adaptation. It turns out there's ways to do that very positively. Okay, so that was the first claim. Now let me move to the second claim. Okay, that we can use detailed analysis to target and prioritize climate action. So I'll try to convince you of this one now. But in order to get to that claim, let me lay out some questions that you really should make me answer along the way. Okay, so let's start with emissions. I had better be able to tell you what are the sources of emissions, where are there the most emissions, where's the most intensity of emissions. Okay, I should be able to tell you about the solutions. Those are our levers, right? What are the relevant solutions? Where do they act? How effective are they? What are the benefits to people of implementing these solutions? Okay, and I want to be clear on one thing. I'm about to present some work on emissions and solutions that is new, right? It's work that was done by Project Drawdown or with collaborators. But what's really innovative and sort of what the roadmap part is this next step, which is helping to prioritize the solutions. So we have emissions, we have the solutions that address them, but what are the most impactful places to start in a given country, in a given province even? What solutions have the greatest leverage? It is in going from emissions to solutions to prioritizing that we are developing and really need the roadmap. So that sort of frames my talk. And now I can sort of get going with some of the interesting data and maps that I'm excited to get to. But first, I want to acknowledge that this has been a team effort. So I get to sit here and show off the results, but I've had a lot of help. On the science side, multiple international collaborators have shared data and expertise, and there has been significant cross-pollination with the Drawdown Explorer project. I also want to acknowledge that Project Drawdown has received funding from Asia Philanthropy Circle and members of the ABC Climate Collective, who really enabled us to do this, to focus on climate solutions in the Southeast Asian context. So what has this team effort led to? So the results are really some unprecedented data aggregation, and from that, some novel analysis. And from that, we take away, and I'm about to share some original insights. So let me talk about data, my love language. There's a lot of data, some of which was developed just for this project. Okay, this is all I could fit on the slide, but I just want to point out that there are trillions of data points. Okay, lots of data. Now let me put that to work. So before that, a confession. I struggled in putting together this briefing because there's so much stuff, there's so much data, there's so many maps, there's so many interesting analyses that it was actually difficult to come up with a narrative. So to try to keep things coherent, I'm going to walk you through some emissions and some related solutions. So emission solutions, and then talk about prioritization. Okay, so, and I'm going to focus on these four sources of emissions since they comprise almost all the land use emissions in Southeast Asia. And together, again, more than half of all the greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors. Okay, so first up is deforestation. Okay, this source of emissions is 42% of all greenhouse gas emissions in Southeast Asia. That's bigger than industry, electricity, and transportation sectors combined. Okay, I think it's worth taking a step back and making sure everyone really gets why deforestation leads to such large emissions, particularly in Southeast Asia. Okay, this is a map of tree cover in the year 2000. So roughly speaking, there are two big bands of trees, right? The boreal forest of the far north and the tropical rainforest of the Amazon, the Congo, and Southeast Asia. Okay, maybe more relevant for the present topic is the next map, because not the trees so much as the carbon. Okay, this shows how much carbon is in those trees, both above and below ground, right? There's a lot of carbon locked up in the roots as well. So one thing you'll notice is that these tropical rainforests have a lot more carbon in them than those northern boreal forests. Okay, and I also want to make note of the scale, which goes up to 500 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per hectare. Okay, a hectare for North American viewers is about 2.5 acres. So to give you a sense of how much carbon that is, 500 tons carbon dioxide equivalent is the emissions from about 10 cars over their lifetime, right? That's about 2 million miles of car is how much is stored in just the wood of 1 hectare of rainforest. Okay, but there's not just the wood, there's also soil. Okay, and there's the same scale there, right? There's a lot of carbon in the soil as well, right? So this adds up to a ton. So sorry, 1,000 tons of carbon per hectare. Okay, but let's focus in on Southeast Asia. Okay, comparing that to the other tropical rainforests, there's a huge amount of carbon in these soils, far more than in the Amazon or Congo basins. Simply put, Southeast Asia has some of the most carbon-rich ecosystems on the planet. And I want to discuss two reasons for this. Okay, one is peatlands. Peatlands are swampy areas where organic matter is kept from decomposing and releasing its carbon and oxygen to poor conditions. Okay, here's a map of peatlands, very prevalent in Southeast Asia. Okay, and then another ecosystem with immense amounts of carbon is mangrove forests. They're not quite as prevalent, but still very important, not only for carbon, but also for biodiversity and in some cases, coastal protection. Okay, here's a location of mangroves. I've zoomed in on Borneo and Sumatra because, right, the mangroves are just along the coast and they can be difficult to see otherwise. Okay, so what are the emissions from deforestation? Okay, where there's all that carbon, if you cut down trees and disturb the soil, there'll be emissions. So let me show you how much. I just want to point out though that for this talk, I'm treating deforestation as an umbrella term for land use change, including mangrove forests, forest on peatlands, and forest on mineral soils. But we're tracking all that under the hood. So here's a map of where significant tree cover loss has taken place since the year 2000. Okay, and you can see some things you'd expect, right? We know there's deforestation in the Amazon. You can see that here. You can see one thing that jumps out to me is the southeastern region of the US and parts of Northern Europe. That's forestry. So those don't really lead to emissions because you're growing and harvesting at the same time, but the satellites do pick it up as tree cover loss. So you see it here. And also you can see the impacts of wildfires, right? Those have been pretty devastating up in Canada and up in Russia. But let's focus in now on Southeast Asia, okay? And here, zooming in, we can see just how widespread the deforestation is, with huge regions that have had more than half of the trees cut down in the last 2 decades. Okay, so what are the emissions associated with this? Okay, so these are the annual emissions associated with land use change. And these numbers may seem smaller than the 500 or so I was talking about before, but these are annual emissions, right? So typically you're cutting down just sort of a small fraction, which is why to show it only goes up to 6. But if you cut down forest, a lot of carbon does eventually wind up in the atmosphere. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to go from emissions to solutions here. So what are some solutions to deforestation? Okay, how do we actually protect forests? Well, I'm going to use the framework of our partners, FPC, which stands for forestpeopleclimate.org. Okay, we have worked with them, and recently we co-hosted a deep dive with FPC into stopping deforestation. I saw that was really excellent. I would recommend you see it. Dario will put a link into the chat to see that, both to FPC and to into that deep dive. So I'm using their framework and terms. So one way is to support the rights of indigenous and local communities. When these communities have strong legal protections and rights to the land, deforestation rates are very low. Improving carbon market integrity. There can be a place for carbon markets, but historically these markets have not always performed as intended. Efforts to improve the integrity of these markets can enable meaningful forest protection. Okay, shifting private finance, influencing financial flows away from deforestation-linked activities to forest-positive activities. Okay, and finally, transforming supply chains. Companies and consumers have a role as well in limiting deforestation for commodity agriculture. Okay, now I want to move on to emissions from rice cultivation. Okay, rice cultivation is around 6% of emissions. These are images of rice paddies in Indonesia. Okay, and here's where rice is grown in Southeast Asia, with Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, and Myanmar the main producers. Okay, and here's a map of the emissions. Vietnam and Indonesia have outsized emissions per unit of land due to multi-cropping practices and water management. There are two sources of emissions we are considering here. One is methane, which is emitted from flooded paddies, right? It's just if you have flooded, if you it just sort of comes with the biogeochemistry of growing rice in flooded conditions. And the other is burning rice straw. Okay. So here are the emissions from rice cultivation, and it's kind of in the same locations, but not exactly because there are different practices around burning rice straw. These are the emissions from burning rice straw. So what are the solutions for addressing these emissions? So first, I want to talk about improving rice water management. So it turns out that draining a rice paddy one or more times during the growing season can have some important benefits. It greatly decreases methane emissions, but it also reduces aggregate water use without hurting yields. So it can be a great solution, but it can be a big ask of a farmer to not keep their paddy flooded. The farmer incurs a risk that the water won't be available later when they need it, and the benefit doesn't go to that farmer of releasing or not drawing more water immediately. However, when institutions are in place to mitigate that risk, this can be a big win, especially in light of the ever increasing demands on irrigation water that were mentioned earlier. Here's some data on how much CO2 equivalent can be saved by implementing draining in rice paddies. Okay. And you can see that Indonesia is huh. I apologize. I think this map is an old version of something. Let me just move past that. Okay, another important source of emissions is burning the straw that remains after the rice has been harvested. Burning rice straw benefits the farmer in that it clears the field quickly to allow for planting the next crop. However, there are several downsides. This leads to significant air quality impacts, and methane and nitrous oxide, powerful greenhouse gases, are released when it's burned. The solution can be as simple as providing farmers with mechanical equipment for removing the straw. Once off the field, the straw can be put to use in a variety of ways. As we discussed earlier, there's going to be even more pressure to clear fields quickly as climate change constrains growing seasons. So I'd like to talk now about fertilizer. Okay, so nitrogen is necessary for crops to grow, and farmers put on nitrogen fertilizer, of course, to get good yields. But nitrogen fertilizer leads to emission of nitrous oxide, a very powerful greenhouse gas. Nitrogen fertilizer is responsible for a little less than 2% of greenhouse gas emissions from Southeast Asia. Okay, and here's a map of the intense regions of nitrous oxide emissions. Okay, so what are the solutions? Well, it turns out that there's lots of regions around the world and in Southeast Asia where you could apply less fertilizer and get the same yields. In other words, there's lots of places where basically too much fertilizer is applied, right? If you put on too much fertilizer, the crop can't take it up, and it winds up leading to nitrous oxide emissions. So here's a map of where this solution has the most potential. Okay, now I want to switch over to animal agriculture. Okay, and animal agriculture we'll see is in a slightly different category. Okay, animal agriculture is about 3% of all emissions in Southeast Asia. And I want to state this is only emissions from the animals themselves, and that's mostly methane from cow burps. Okay, if you do the full accounting um, of greenhouse gas emissions associated with animal agriculture, there are also emissions associated with growing their feed and often clearing land for pastures. Okay, but that's already been counted elsewhere. Okay, so why is it that animal ag leads to such outsized emissions? It's worth talking through that, I think, because it's really important. Here's some data, some published data on the climate impact of various types of food. From vegetables with very low emissions per pound of food up to beef with really very, very high emissions per per pound of food. Okay, and you'll notice that just about everything at the top is an animal product. Okay, that's because um, roughly speaking, they're eating things they're eating crops of some sort, but they don't they use a lot of that energy for their own metabolism, basically. Okay, but then if you look up at the very top, there's beef, which has to use energy for its own metabolism and is burping a lot of methane. So really very, very high emissions associated with beef in particular. Okay, so let's talk about possible solutions. And so you may have heard about some of these solutions here. Okay, improving how the cows are managed on pasture, trying to breed better cows that can produce more meat or milk, or other animals too, of course. Um, and then like various food additives or vaccines to reduce methane. Okay, I'm not considering them here, okay, because it's not the how, it's the cow, right? There are much more powerful levers. In particular, diet change is a far more powerful lever than how you manage cattle. Okay, the emissions associated with the steak on the right are far greater than the emissions associated with the vegetarian meal on the left. Okay, I want to pause and be very clear on 2 points. The first is simply to acknowledge the potential for hypocrisy of a scientist from a country in the West that overeats a lot, is advising or saying things that come across as advice for people who live in Southeast Asia on their diets. Okay, I'm trying to present the science and proceed with humility, but I just want to acknowledge that. And again, I'd like to restate that there are many food insecure people in Southeast Asia. No one, at least no one associated with Project Drawdown, is suggesting that climate should come before their nutritional needs. In fact, the analysis that I'll show a little bit later, there are some numbers associated with diet change that only considers dietary change after food security has been achieved for all, right? Make sure everyone has a nutritious, healthy diet, and then look to see if some people somewhere could have a little less meat, basically. Okay, reducing food waste is another powerful lever. Approximately 1/3 of all food that's grown is wasted. Okay, this means that reducing loss and waste could greatly decrease, by 1/3, basically, emissions associated with all the aspects of growing food. So we recently had a deep dive in conjunction with our partners at Refed. And so I think, Dara, you have a link to put in the chat if someone wants to see that. So I'd like to show a figure of per capita food waste emissions. And this figure actually does appear in the deep dive. I've zoomed back out to the global scale because it would be pretty shabby of me to highlight the impacts of waste in Southeast Asia without the context of some of the countries, one of which I'm talking from, is really very extreme. Okay, so now I can sort of move to the next fun step because I've gone through a bunch of sources of emissions, talked about solutions associated with them, and now again the fun part, the roadmap part. Okay, so emissions, size, and locations of solutions, but how can this data be used to get started? Like where to implement a solution? Okay, and I want to start with sector priorities. Okay, and please bear with me. This is a little bit of a walk. Okay, but I want to start by looking at all of Southeast Asia and just looking one sector at a time. So I'm going to start with deforestation, and I'll go in the order in which I presented emissions and solutions. So these are the emissions in blue. Okay, so here's a little bar representing 1.6 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year associated with deforestation. And now I want to show the range of avoidable emissions in green. So the range of avoidable emissions goes from no emissions avoided up at the top, right? You're still getting 1,600 megatons, all the way down to zero, since it's possible in theory to stop no deforestation or all the deforestation. Okay, these green bars will make a little more sense when I show you methane, which is next. Okay, so methane from rice is a total of 0.3 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. And of that, you can only address around half as indicated here. Okay, you can't fully address it. No one is proposing that. right? Until someone sort of brings perennial rice online that doesn't need to be flooded or something like that, there will be some methane emissions. Okay, so it can't go to zero. And I want to point out that we did not consider decreasing rice yields anywhere. We did not consider saying, oh, it's growing more efficiently there. Why don't you stop growing it and you grow more? None of that. No decreases in yield anywhere. Okay, so that is how much with all the interventions we're allowing in the rice sector, you can go from the 0.3 down to about 1.5 gigatons. Okay, and here's rice straw burning. So this really is relatively small in terms of climate emissions. It's super important, I think, because it's relatively easy addressable, right? Farmers just need access to baling equipment, and it's super important in terms of air quality and farmer income, right? I don't know if I remember to mention this, but when farmers get straw off the land, they can turn that into things for which they get some revenue. Okay, fertilizer emissions are very important. In some places, you may remember from that map earlier, there were some hotspots. Okay, and here are emissions associated with diets and potential savings from shifting diets. Okay, let me repeat. This is in some sense a double counting of emissions. Okay, a lot of the emissions I'm assigning to diets have already shown up in deforestation or rice methane or fertilizer emissions. Okay, not much leverage here. That green bar of possible outcomes looks very different or would look very different in other regions. I haven't calculated it in other regions. Not much leverage because the analysis has more calories going to the food insecure before optimizing to a planet healthy diet. Okay, and reducing food loss and waste, another big lever. So I've been showing this at the scale of the region, but of course we can drill down to the national level, okay, even the subnational level. But think about this one right here. Here's the Philippines. Okay, this suggests in the Philippines, reducing rice methane, harvesting rice straw, and improving fertilizer management together have about half the potential of mitigating climate change as stopping deforestation, but possibly with a much more tractable set of interventions. Okay. And here's another one for Thailand, just to show that things look different right here. Here, methane is really very, very important. Um, so I think these figures contain a lot of really helpful information. I'm even proud of this analysis, but I'd say there are two things that need to come next. Okay, one is which of these solutions deserves priority given the local context? Okay, and the other is, so this tells me what, but I need to know where. Okay, I want to say a little more about which of these solutions deserves priority given the local context. So I think that's really an important third step here, emissions, size of emissions, potential importance of solutions, and then which one gets priority given the local context. That local context thing is something that I don't pretend to speak to from here as a scientist based in the West, but we're providing the tools and talking to partners in the region. And for us, the dream is that this work and of the Drawdown Explorer we've mentioned will be used by people to really take this and decide, given local context, what makes the most sense for a solution. But what I can't talk about though is where. Okay, and so I want to talk about, oh, I went the wrong way, geographic priorities. Okay, let's look at opportunities. And so a lot of these things, these solutions kind of lend themselves to sort of a hotspot analysis, right? An 80-20 rule, which is the idea that 80% of the benefits take place in 20% of an area. And I'm talking about 80-20 rules and showing you a 46-5 rule. A presentation no, I suppose, but I bet you get it. So for rice cultivation, the biggest opportunities are concentrated in the Mekong Delta. Okay, in fact, 46% of the benefits of addressing methane emissions from rice can be obtained in just 5% of the area. Okay, there are similar hotspots for deforestation also. So this map shows regions of high deforestation. Okay, so we've gone from these kind of big blobs of deforestation where yes, at least a few trees were cut down here in this pixel, to a relatively small percentage of areas where it's most active. In fact, sort of these active hotspots take place on just 12% of forest area. Okay, but we can actually do hotspots within hotspots. Okay, so what I want to do here is call out those hotspots that are on peatlands. Okay, so you've got active deforestation on peatlands, which contain crazy amounts of carbon, and important for biodiversity, all sorts of things. So these are on less than 2% of forest area. Okay, these are definitely the highest priority areas for action. Okay, we can sort of zoom into a particular country. And I want to do that. So first I want to remind you of, go back to this figure here. So showing, several types of emissions, several solutions, and sort of ranking how much potential there is. But so I want to go if I try to go from here to where, I can make a map in each province of Thailand, which of these solutions is the most effective in a particular province. Okay, so remember, deforestation was the largest, but it's concentrated in a relatively small number of places. And improving rice cultivation is the most important solution in the areas indicated in yellow. But there's some where actually improving nutrient management is the most effective solution there. Okay. I didn't include burning of rice straw because there's no subnational data, right? I can't draw any conclusions about where that's most effective without subnational data. So I've sort of reached the end of the maps I want to show you, which is sad because more maps would be lovely for all of us, I'm sure. But I want to keep this under a certain amount of time, which I have. So I want to talk, and then leave plenty of time for questions. So I want to get to some take-home messages. Okay, so I would like you to take away the knowledge that Southeast Asia's transition to a cleaner climate future is critical to Southeast Asia, but it's also critical to the globe, right? We we need Southeast Asia to get it right, and I'm happy to help supporting them with this research. Okay, there are multiple levers in the system. Okay, the ones that I've called out as being the most important are reducing deforestation, changing diets, improving rice agriculture, and reducing food loss and waste. Okay, and again, I want to highlight what we've done, right? We've found that a spatial analysis reveals hotspots and opportunities. Okay, we've shown we can prioritize by sector and geography, and the methods can be applied to other regions. And I really want to stress that this is a preview of coming attractions. Okay, we look forward to being able to do this for other regions as well, basically. Okay, and sort of that really ties into what is next. So what is next on this particular project is that first I want to and we plan to incorporate feedback from stakeholders in Southeast Asia. I emailed many of the people with whom I've spoken earlier, a lot of the people who so kindly shared preliminary or sort of advanced versions of data sets with me. They've been invited. Many said they would come. I of course cannot see who is attending right now. But I've requested feedback. I hope to get that, and so when we start to finalize some of these analyses in the Southeast Asian context, I can have as much local relevance as possible. I want to stress that also next is these data and these methods will be shared. Okay, the codes and the data layers will all go in the public domain and be freely available, along with the reports as well. And finally, the Drawdown Explorer is going to be launching soon. And the Drawdown Explorer really is a way to help provide the tools for researchers um, and NGOs and interested parties from around the world to do similar analyses. There is several. There's at least one briefing. I forget exactly what is available right now, but Daria will put into the chat some links, sort of describing the launch of the Explorer, which is expected in a preliminary sense in June of 2025. And so that is what's next, and that is the end of this presentation. So thank you very much for your attention, and I will, I guess, stop sharing screen, and I would be happy to take some questions.
Thank you, James. That was fantastic. What, sorry. Let's get into some questions. We got some great questions from everyone, both before the webinar and during. So I don't know if we'll get to them all, but we'll definitely start. Let's start with, what are some of the technologies or interventions that will help improve and scale nutrient management? And what about water use in rice cultivation? You spoke about this a little, but if you want to talk about it a bit more.
Yeah, well, nutrient management is, boy, it's going to be hard for me not to dive right down to the details on that one. That was a trap, Daria. I think, I guess what I'd like to highlight there is that there's some really powerful methods out there and some really good data showing where farmers tend to be over applying nitrogen fertilizer. And farmers almost always do this for reasons that are very rational for the farmer, but are responding to incentives. There are lots of interventions. Intervention sounds like, sorry, someone's sort of showing up on the farmer's doorstep and pounding on the door. There's lots of support that can be offered to farmers that will help them use the fertilizer more judiciously. If anyone on the audience is thinking of helping with fertilizer in the Southeast Asian context, I would love to see that. But I will point out that the data I showed you here assumes no change in yield. But in reality, there are places where yields could be improved, and it would be best to, there are lots of opportunities for intervention in improving yields at the same time as improving nutrient use efficiency. And there was a question about water management for rice. I forget the details of the question. So you want to repeat that, Daria, so I don't just ramble on?
Sure thing. What about water use in rice cultivation? I think similarly,
Oh,
what are the interventions?
but I find that to be an absolutely fascinating one because it's this really, I think, classical issue where what's the farmers' incentives do not align with society's incentives, right? And I touched on this very briefly, how a farmer in Southeast Asia is taking a risk by not keeping their paddy flooded. And so there's almost a chicken and egg problem where you sort of need a strong civil society to have the structures where the farmer can have great confidence that the water will be there when they need it. But if you can solve that problem, then it's better for everyone, right? Because the farmer is typically paying for irrigation water. If they can use a little less water, there's some small savings for the farmer of not having to pay for the diesel for the pump, or pay for the provider of the irrigation water. But that water then goes further and someone else can. And again, this will get more important as climate change places more stresses on hydrological systems and rainfall patterns. So
Great. Can you share more about the reliability of the geospatial data that you used and the sources? For example, how reliant are we or not on regional governments to provide or enable data collection, and where you might have encountered data gaps?
oh, that I love that question. Thanks. Actually, I first want to tie it back to the two solutions I just talked about. One is the data for uptake of advanced alternate advanced water management. So, non-continuous flooding or drainage or alternate wetting and drying, whatever you want to call it. There is very, very little data there. I had the chance to go to the field with Anton Erfels of International Rice Research Institute in the Mekong Delta. That was really eye-opening for me, learning about that. But there is an effort underway to get better data. You can't get that from satellite data, unfortunately, because there's so much cloud cover that you don't know if there's a drainage incident has happened by the time the cloud's clear and you can take a picture. So that data is really spotty. I guess I went on that little rant because if anyone on this call is in a position to help acquire that data, support someone who is collecting that data, or help clean that data, or a student who's working on that data, it's a great thing. It'd be super important. So a lot of the data, there are holes in the data for sure. A lot of the data sources are quite old. People who've seen a version of this talk earlier might have noticed that some of the methane results changed a little bit. That was because I got better data on precisely uptake of these water management practices. A lot of the data that I use comes from satellite data, so no reliance on governments, but the data for fertilizer use and um, and much data for crops. A lot of that comes from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and their methods are truly opaque. It's very hard to know how they get their data, but very often they do get theirs from governments. But yes, data quality is very much a concern in doing studies like this. Other than the rice, I don't have anything in particular to point to what I show that I question. But yeah, often an issue, and thanks for that question.
Thank you. Then how can Southeast Asia's food systems mitigate climate change in a just and inclusive manner while honoring local socio-cultural contexts?
That is a great question. I think that the things, and again, with a big dose of humility, knowing that this is something that I'd really like to thrash out with any one of, I'm sure many people on this call. Together, we could probably come up with a better answer than I will right now. Um, right now, Southeast Asia has, in general, very healthy diets. And so that reduces a lot of, reduces something that would be really degrading ecosystems and putting pressure on indigenous people and vulnerable populations, maybe if people had the eating habits of other countries. But the trend is ticking up. I think on the demand side, it would be lovely to see Southeast Asia manage to maintain healthy diets and food security for a very wide population. On the supply side, I think there's a lot of places, and forgive me for sort of going back to areas where I have particular research expertise. There's a lot of places in Southeast Asia where there's been inadequate investment in agronomy. If I've been talking in terms of emissions, but really what matters in many cases is not emissions on the landscape. I'm still glad I gave the talk, don't worry. Not emissions on the landscape like I was talking about, but emissions per unit calorie produced, say. There are many places where the number of calories could be produced, and I think that would be a way to help achieve growing demand and reduce pressures on natural ecosystems, right? The reason we didn't want to delve into that from a research point of view is that it's very difficult to do that to make that type of recommendation with sort of, I think, appropriate cultural sensitivity. And yeah, there really does need to be knowledge in a local context before any specific recommendations there are made. But in general, I think that is to my mind what that would look like.
Thanks. And then we received this question in a few different contexts, but the main idea of it is how can we incentivize or teach farmers about rice burning and what are the alternatives to rice burning, rice straw burning?
Um, I've seen evidence. The evidence I've seen has been in India, not Southeast Asia, uh, of farming communities being provided with mechanical balers, and that's great for the farmers because they don't really want to be burning the they don't necessarily want to be burning the straw. They just want to be able to plant again quickly. So with a mechanical baler, they can get it off the field quickly. And then once it's off the field, there's actually quite a few things that can be done with it. It can be used um, for firewood. It can be used for compost. You can grow rice straw mushrooms on it, which I only found out recently. I just never put those together. That rice straw mushrooms came from rice straw. So I think that type of intervention, and again, I think that I want to call out that that is, it's worth noting that the type of actor you need to address that is very different than the type of actor you may need to address alternate wetting and drying, right? If I am an NGO or a philanthropist, I can identify a community which is producing a lot of pollution that's impacting where people live, and just actually just provide or subsidize baling equipment to help farmers get the rice off. Like an individual actor can do that, but an individual actor can't really intervene um, on the water management side, right? That's more for sort of institutions, an entire provincial water management agency or some type of insurance product that will reimburse the farmer if for whatever reason there is no water later. So I do think it's interesting that rice straw burning lends itself to that very discrete type of intervention.
And this question is more broadly about Drawdown Explorer, but will Drawdown Explorer enable people to find out for a specific type of intervention at the subnational level or even more granular, where is the best place to focus on for that type of intervention?
Yes, we very much intend to do that. That work is underway. That work has helped informed this project. This project has helped inform this roadmap in Southeast Asia project has helped inform the Explorer as well. So we are providing, where possible, high resolution maps of individual solutions. Um, the type of analysis I presented here will not be built into the Explorer. I mean, I think functionality to do that across the 85 or so solutions uh, is really a daunting thought. But the data layers will be there, and as tools are developed, and again, all the tools I've developed here will be made available. So people with, I mean, some technical skill is required, of course. They can download the layers and then use these methods to sort of find hotspots or comparative best levers in individual provinces.
Great, thanks, James. I think we have time for just a couple more questions. I would like to know where you see, or what's the next step for this work, this research that we've done on Southeast Asia.
Well, I'm very serious that I'm hoping that the people I've spoken to will contact me to share their thoughts. I've offered to send these maps. I think now that people are seeing this, that they'll want these maps in the zillions of other maps as well. I promise not to overdo it. And I would love feedback on that. So I mean, what's next is getting that feedback, wrapping up the research, and writing reports and disseminating that to as wide an audience as possible, and being sure to do that in a way that to package the results in a way that that stakeholders in Southeast Asia find it useful, and that people who want to do analogous work around the world, because I said Southeast Asia is the most important region, I didn't say it's the only region, do it around the world, can use it as a template. So I think that's what's next, is to wrap up the project in a way that's consistent with those two goals.
Great, thanks, James. And then our final question is, what do you want people to remember from this conversation today?
Um, Sort of, can I say two things? Because
Yes.
I really want people to come back and check out the Explorer. I think it's really going to be cool. Launching again in sometime in June of this year. But in I think in the Southeast Asian context, I guess I want people to really come to appreciate, as I have, just how incredible a region it is with the amount of carbon, and the like, how healthy the diets are now, and I hope that can change, and just to sort of keep an eye, and the strides that it can continue to make in addressing climate change for its own sake and for the globe.